Well, there's a darker scenario here too, Gwyndair, and that is that all these waters, the waters of the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, they all originate in Tibet, yes, which is, as we know, Chinese territory. And if China is running short of water, maybe China will decide to divert some of those waters to flow into China in the way that we diverted the Snowy to flow into the Murray, for example.
Yes, or some Canadians have on occasion talked about diverting water to flow into the United States. That was a long time ago now, but there were these extraordinary plans in both Canada and Russia at one time to divert entire rivers that flowed into the Arctic Ocean and send them south for profit instead. Profit in Canada, I don't know quite what the rationale was in the Soviet Union. No, there is, I mean, if you go to Russia now, I was there in May, there is a good deal of paranoia about China, and it is driven largely by the consciousness that Siberia has got about 40 million people in it, if that, and is a fairly promising agricultural area in a climate change regime. There will still be lots of water, and it will be warmer. So you can probably grow more food there. And at the same time, China, just south of it, has 1 billion and 1.3 billion people now, but it'll be well over 1.5 billion. And China faces the loss of the water in its rivers from the melting glaciers, the failure of the northeast monsoon, which feeds the North Chinese wheat crop, and rising sea levels. A storm surge could take out Shanghai in 10 years. So where do all those climate refugees from China go, if not Siberia? I don't think it's that simple, but boy, does that drive strategic thinking.
And Peter, you should know that this pipeline is already under construction. A pipeline from the Tibetan Himalayas to take the water that now feeds the 5 major rivers of Asia. And you want to see a coming conflict, it's going to be over the water that China's taken. And by the way, Gwyn, you've been out of the country and so have I, but just the other day a think tank in Quebec announced that they're promoting massive exports of water to the United States. So it's all revised, as I knew it would happen.
Well, we know that Canada's north of the United States, so it's downhill.
Well, that's indeed the basis.
So you don't have to pump it, right?
Most of the great Australian pipeline schemes seem to be based on that principle.
Yeah, well, we've had schemes in Australia to bring the water from the Kimberleys down to Perth in a channel, or to tow icebergs from the Antarctic, or pipe it across from Tasmania. There's no end to these schemes, John.
If I could comment on the whole resource conflict scenario, the strategic guys love this stuff, but almost always the optimal solution is to use the resource more efficiently. And
That's great in theory, John. Let me just interrupt here. We can't get our state, we're all in the same country, and we can't get Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia to work together on the Murray.
Well, we certainly have plenty of trouble. On the other hand, we in Brisbane use half as much water as we did 18 months ago per person. I mean, we've had to, but we've managed that. We could produce the current food from the Murray with half the water we currently use and produce the same value of output.
That's a different... Well, there's two questions there, and I think you're confusing two. I mean, we see great goodwill here in Melbourne, where water consumption has dropped by about 30% since the 1990s. In Sydney, I think, uses the same amount of water now as it did in the 80s, despite a large increase in population. There's tremendous goodwill amongst the ordinary population, I think, to conserve water, to bucket out that bath water and all the rest of it, and we all know how bucket back. But when it comes to, at a political level, the states working with the Commonwealth, the cooperation with farmers groups and so on, we see a tremendous lack of progress.
We certainly haven't seen great progress, there's no doubt about it. But I think as the heat's been on, we have seen gradual improvements. And ultimately, fighting about these things is a really silly thing to do. The potential for improved efficiency and cooperation is there if we choose to take it.
I think you raise an important issue, Peter, is because, the Murray has been in serious trouble for generations, and generations of Australians have stood up and said, hey fellas, listen up, the Murray's in serious trouble, but we still are in the situation we are. So ultimately it gets back to the democratic process and the desire of citizens like you and I to do something about it. There's only one capital city in Australia that votes, that changes their vote on the Murray River, and that's Adelaide. It's not Melbourne. Melbourne and Adelaide, when you look at polling, both of them equally concerned about the health of the Murray River. They both say, goodness me, I'm petrified. But there is only one city that actually changes their vote on that issue. And those 5 marginal seats in Adelaide are now playing out on our federal parliamentary stage, and we are getting some policy progress on the Murray. Nothing's changed in the real world, but there are policy shifts. And until people like you in the audience and people like me decide to act on these issues, we will continually break down at implementation. There are wheelbarrows full of glossy brochures saying, the rivers are dying, we're running out of water, we need to get smarter, blah, blah, blah. And we live in the world we live in. And why is that? It's because largely of the power of particular vested interests and people who have involved in managing and controlling that water and have been for 100 years are still the people who are in charge. When we go and talk to politicians, there's one group, the ACF will go in and there'll be 5, 6 other people arguing a completely alternate case about their need to get their hand into the public purse.
And I want to agree with that very much as an outside observer. I think the people here are so ahead of their politicians, and it seems to me that it doesn't seem to matter what the political party, just like in my country at home, the received wisdom is you can continue on as normal. Australia is part of the Cairns exporting group. It's business as usual. We can still play in the big leagues. We can still continue to grow and have this model of economic development. And between energy and water, those two alone, forget the fish in the sea and the forests and everything else we're running out of, we have got to, we're slamming up against reality. We are going to have to find different ways of living in this world. We're going to have to stop thinking in our so-called first world that we're somehow above nature and we're somehow able to escape the laws that affect every other species. We're just a species. And I worry because I fell in love with Australia the first time I came here. It reminds me so much of my country, except for the water. And your water goes down the other way and you have different stars in the sky. And the birds are different, but the institutions are the same.
No, very little snow, too.
And the political institutions feel so similar, and I feel a kind of panic, I have to tell you, with what I see happening here and the denial at the level of and the vested interests and the mining interests and the bottled water interests. I've heard about a bottled water taking near the Moorabool yesterday where they pay something like $198 fee a year to take massive amounts of water out. What are our priorities? Who is making the decisions here around this precious water? I think the people of Australia are in charge, and you guys got to take over.
John Quiggin, it does seem that some straightforward and obvious things that governments could do just never happen. Things like, say, mandating that new houses are built with water tanks. It seems a pretty straightforward thing to do these days.
Well, part of the problem with water is that nothing's straightforward. It depends on when the rain falls during the year, whether a water tank makes sense, for example. If you have a hot, dry summer, it may well be that having a water tank doesn't do you very much good.
No, but all the time you're flushing the toilet with that water tank during the winter, that's keeping more water in the reservoir for the summer. I mean, there's still a benefit.
There's still a benefit, but it's not always as large a benefit as you might think. I mean, as an example which I came across early in my career is that for a long time we thought the problems of salinity could be resolved by planting trees. It seemed like a good idea, but it turns out trees use an awful lot of water and they take a long time to fix the problem. And so you have to be very careful about where you plant trees and that you plant them in the places where they're needed and not where they're not, or you can actually make the problem worse.
Peter, I think it's important to recognise too that there's no silver bullet. You know, there's no fat controller that's going to come and say, bang, it's all fixed, don't worry about it, get on with your life. But there are multiple... it's been death by 1,000 cuts. It's going to be a whole series of things that we need to do all at once, both in terms of sorting out our political kerfuffle and getting institutional arrangements and the technology and the behaviour change sorted out. Things like rainwater tanks will not solve the problem on their own, but they are a key part of the solution. I think about 6% of houses in Australian capital cities have rainwater tanks. You know, I've got a rainwater tank at my place. It's been dry for a long time. It hasn't run out. You know, in the 3 years, flushes the toilet and laundry, reduces my water use by 40%. I would hope that our issue is we need to get the water companies to allow me to get donate that water back into the Yarra River, where Melbourne takes about 70% of its water, and that's the institutional breakdown. Why can't I choose that some of those savings can actually get put back into the environment?
You're listening to The National Interest on ABC Radio National, discussing water at the 2008 Melbourne Writers' Festival with guests Paul Sinclair from the Australian Conservation Foundation, Canadian environmentalist and writer Maud Barlow, Canadian international relations specialist Gwyn Dyer, who's written a book called Climate Wars, and Professor John Quiggin, economist from the University of Queensland. And I want to get you all now, it seems to me that underlying this discussion really is a kind of fundamental issue about where to from here. Do we need a technological fix? Do we need to go further down the route of desalination plants and perhaps whole new types of technology? Or do we need to, in fact, break down the dam walls, let the rivers run free and revert to a different type of relationship to water? More Barlow.
Well, I think we'll probably all say it doesn't have to be 100% of either, but the question will be, where do we put our priority? There's a huge place for technology, obviously in recycling and so on. My concern and researching Blue Covenant really brought this home, particularly with the US government and the Chinese government and to some extent the Europeans and very much Australia, that technology will save us, that it's business as usual, we can keep living the way we're living, that we'll find technological solutions, and they include desalination, which I think is going to prove to be a terrible mistake for all of us. I mean, there's a place for smaller scale desal, and there are places in the world that have no choice. We are not there yet here. Desalination is energy intensive, it's polluting, it puts a very polluting brine back into the ocean. Our oceans are already in trouble, and it's very expensive, and it's energy intensive, and now they're talking about nuclear powered desal. That's the big new hot panacea. Then there's nanotechnology that will save us, totally unregulated, because all sorts of companies working on nanotechnology in water, and some early science tells us that there's some real concerns about what happens to nanoparticles in water, in what happens to animals and getting into vital organs and so on. There's the whole toilet to tap technology, which people here are being told they have to accept. There's the whole kind of water recycling. I mean, the biggest water company in the world right now is probably General Electric. This is the new area of science, and there's just total and complete dependency or hope or funding going into this area rather than conservation, source protection. And if we allow the corporate takeover of our water, which is happening everywhere with this corporate cartel, we will not have water for nature. Who's going to buy it? People who are wealthy will be able to buy water. People who are poor will continue to die, and people are dying now of no water. And conservation will not be, what private company can operate on the basis of conservation and equity? The water secure future is based on conservation, source protection on one hand, and water justice on the other. And the private sector cannot deliver on that.
I think, I agree partially with what Maud's saying. Like the technology isn't the whole answer. It's going to be part of the answer. For example, a water efficient shower head. If you have a 4-minute shower, it's fantastic. You save lots of water. If I stand under that shower with a gin and tonic and a bucket of olives for 4 hours, it makes no difference. It's a human being who is driving the machine that ultimately is the critical factor in a lot of these decisions. And we just need to get out of the mindset of thinking conservation means we've got to wear hair shirts and flog ourselves to death. It doesn't. We can actually generate new ways of making wealth, of building the resilience, the capacity of our communities and ecosystems to deal with shocks by conserving things. The guy who installed my rainwater tank, right, he doesn't return my calls anymore because he's so busy. Now, he had to go and get training. He's put on an apprentice. Someone's making the pump. Someone's making the tank. What do you know? There's a buck to be turned. And that's part of the solution.
John Quiggin.
Yeah, desal and recycling, I think, are relevant in terms of urban water in Australia because we're on the coast and you can generate water for urban users at a reasonable sort of price, $2 a kilolitre or so. It doesn't solve the big problems of the environmental flows and agriculture. And there, I think we do need We certainly can't rely on markets alone, as we've seen. We also can't rely on public ownership alone. All the rivers in Australia have been publicly owned since the beginning of last century. So we need to get policies right. We need to have a price on water that reflects its environmental value, and we need to give the environment a place in the water market, which it hasn't had.
Windai.
All the above notwithstanding, I think there is a problem we haven't begun to comprehend. There are 6 times as many people as there were on this planet at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There's actually 3 times as many as there were when I was born. And an increasing proportion of them are consuming at industrialized levels. I mean, that's the core of the problem. And although everything that Maud and Paul and John said is true, you're nibbling at the edges. We have a crisis, and we are going to have to find a way through it. And really, water is a component in that crisis which obviously must not be neglected, because you've got to have this stuff to grow your crops and even to drink. But it is a component in a larger crisis. And the larger crisis scares me half to death. We have a prospect, not a certainty, but a prospect of a future in which you would regard today's drought in Australia as the good old days, and in which you would regard the prices of grain after 2 or 3 years of doubling and tripling as the good old days. So, I fully agree with all of this, but Christ, it's terrifying what's going on out there. And if we don't get the climate thing under control, which has got to do, of course, with our own emissions and so on, all the other stuff won't matter. I'm sorry, but it won't.
Well, you've actually suggested we have to become climate engineers ourselves, haven't you? In your book, you actually suggest we have to go another step in technology.
I would never suggest geoengineering solutions, and neither would anybody who advocates them, if I didn't have the fairly confident knowledge that we are not going to get on top of this in time. I mean, really, we must not go beyond 2 degrees hotter than the baseline. I mean, it'll be bad enough if we get to 2 degrees, but beyond that, somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees hotter, you hit the feedbacks. The natural processes kick in, which take over the warming, and now you can cut your emissions after that all you want, and it won't make a damn bit of difference. Permafrost melting, releasing methane, the sea surface gets so warm it stops absorbing carbon dioxide, starts emitting it. Once you're there, you're lost. So if you think that human politics will not get our emissions down before we hit 2 degrees hotter, you'd better listen to the people who are talking about geoengineering.
And just explain what
geoengineering is keeping the temperature down even though the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere says it should be hotter, essentially. And there is, for example, a Nobel Prize-winning atmospheric chemist, a man called Paul Crutzen, who announced, or who suggested, knowing he would be facing a lynch mob about 2 years ago, that we might well have to inject sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to reflect some sunlight, and it's pollution, of course, in order to keep the temperature down while we work on getting our emissions down, which is probably a 50-year process. And you mustn't ever go beyond 2 degrees while that's happening. So, in that sense, we are in a global generational crisis, of which water is a huge component.
I'm going to invite questions from the audience. We have not a lot of time, but if there's someone who has a pressing question, put your hand up and there's a microphone which will come to you, so just wait for a microphone.
Thank you. I've just returned from the National Australia Water Summit, which was in Melbourne the last 3 days, and it seems like this market game is seen by all parties as the panacea to our problems. And of course, like you all mentioned, the problem is that the environment doesn't trade on the stock exchange. And seeing that they all agree on this wrong or horrible model, is there a way you think, and this is the question, to work with those market rules to satisfy the environment, in other words, to sort of put it on the stock exchange?
Yeah, so how do we give, John Quicken, how do we give the environment a place in the market?
Well, I think there's two parts to it in terms particularly of the Murray-Darling. One is to go over the allocations that we made in the past, and we know that they were too large, we have to cut them back, and then we have to go ahead and actually bite the bullet and pay out public money paid for from taxes to buy water back from the environment. Those are the two crucial steps if we're going to achieve success within a market framework.
So we have to rely on the government to be the de facto guarantor of the environment and act on its behalf in the market.
Well, I think these are called market-based instruments, and it's important to remember both parts of this. This isn't a market spontaneously emerging and solving our problems. It's policy instruments that use trade, but governments still have to do the heavy lifting.
Well, I would clearly, I guess I'd say I have to disagree. I think the Murray-Darling is being privatized to maintain a free trade regime and economic globalization at the risk of the Murray-Darling dying. And I think water markets are part of the problem. The water of Australia belongs to the people of Australia. You need to reassert that with your governments. Water markets, I don't believe, have any place in a system where every single drop is up for grabs now. Water must be seen as a public commons, a public trust, a human right, and something that needs to be protected by all of us for future generations. Some people getting rich on this crisis is simply not acceptable. Water is not like running shoes or cars. It should not be a for-profit commodity in our society.
Hello, I've got a question for Maud Barlow. You mentioned a couple of times the mining industry is getting preferential treatment. Can you expand a bit on that?
There are probably people here who can give you more specifics, but what I have read and heard tells me that the mining industry here has had not a fair go, right? The term in Australia is a fair go, has had a free ride. And has had access to water, paying very little or no royalties. And I think that these vested interests, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm coming from a country where everything's wonderful and I'm here saying you've got these problems. Mining industry in my country is probably the worst, most polluting international industries in the world. We're really quite ashamed of our mining companies. So the only difference between our country and your country is we have more water. We're trying to ruin it as fast as we can. So please believe me, I'm not saying that. But I guess the important thing here is that we have to look at who's had access to massive amounts of water. We can put all the high-tech shower heads in the world in. That's not going to change the reality until we take back the allocations of water that are going into the private coffers of bottled water companies, the uranium and gold mining and other industries, and some of the entrenched export agriculture industries. We're going to have to take back, we're going to have to say you can't get rich from water when people here are going to have to drink toilet to tap water because there's nothing clean left. I just think the priorities have to change. A mining industry is one of them.
Well, I mean, there certainly are instances like Olympic Dam and things where groundwater's been accessed on very preferential terms, but the bulk of Australian water is used in agriculture, in irrigated agriculture. And I think I do have to disagree. Australia should be a food exporter. The world needs to be fed, and if countries like Australia and the US don't do their bit, I think the future that Gwen's talking about is going to arrive a lot sooner.
Okay, one of Gwen.
I'm afraid so. It's the time when every country fed itself is a long time past. Maybe we shouldn't have grown the population like that in the richer countries that could afford to import food from elsewhere, but we did, and that's where the people are now. And I mean, they talk about England as a six-planet country. You know, I mean, to have your per capita share of the world's resources, you need 6 planets to live like the English do. Well, there's no short-term solution for that in terms of the English gardening their way out of the problem.
Peter, sorry, I reckon we need to just ground things a little bit in the biophysical world here. Yes, we do need to feed the world, but those systems that we're talking about in the Murray-Darling Basin are currently leaching things like arsenic and aluminium from the wetlands. we're talking about a completely trash system that is not going to produce, a duck, let alone tons and tons of food for export. So, in principle, of course, we need to be looking at how we can export a component of our water use as high-value water, but certainly not low-value product as makes up, 80% of the water we suck out of the Murray is used to produce export income. Now, the real question we need to be asking is, how can we make that export income in a way that doesn't use as much water? Now, that might be a university degree, it might be a hospital service, it might be powdered milk, as we currently is one of our major exports. And they're the real questions. How do we use our water smarter? If the question is generating export income, well, what's the best use for every litre of water? And we're not having that debate.
Absolutely.
And I do want to say that this notion that somehow we're being selfish if we stop exporting to poor countries or other countries is not taking into account the reality of how we have treated the Global South. I mean, basically all through our trade agreements, through the World Bank, we have said to Global South countries, take your best land and use it for export of the products we can't grow here that you don't necessarily need, but we want. And meanwhile, we'll dump our cheap products in your country. I mean, the story of the World Trade Organization, which once again collapsed, the Doha round once again collapsed about a month ago because the Global South said no. And part of the problem with these trade rules is that they always favor the powerful. The poor countries have not been able to feed themselves because they're not allowed to stockpile food under the World Trade Organization's agricultural policies for times of famine. These policies have been designed in the global north, by the global north, or the west, if you want to put it that way, for the privilege of wealthier countries. We have all got to look to more sustainable models. This notion of business as usual cannot sustain us. It will not sustain the Global South. And in fact, if we were to stop dumping on and taking the water and other minerals and biodiversity out of the Global South, it would have a whole much bigger chance of surviving.
Thank you all for being part of this conversation at the Melbourne Writers' Festival and for being my guests on The National Interest on ABC Radio National.